Why do we still have the Electoral College? This is a question that arises every 4 years and perplexes the American public. As we approach an election, this question is fresh on our minds once again. Joining us today to help us understand the complexity of this American institution and why we still have it is Alexander Keyssar. Alexander is the Matthew W. Stirling Jr. Professor of History and Social Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And he is the author of award winning books such as The Right to Vote and Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College, which will be linked in the description below. Enjoy the episode. So, the Electoral College is obviously a very complicated institution. Many people don't know exactly what it does or what it's there for. It comes up every 4 years around the election cycle, and people are asking all these questions. But I'd like to start with why you wrote this book.
A fair question. Um, I wrote the book. Um, the book had a complicated origin. I mean, I had originally thought of writing a book about different, it's years ago, about a set of different, not fully democratic institutions that we have in our electoral politics. Um, and the Electoral College was going to be one of them. And then when when I began doing the research and really thinking about it, the topic with the Electoral College grew. It grew into a book length version itself. And the way that the way the way the book ended up being shaped, the question, which is its title, why do we still have the Electoral College, emerged really from learning some of the history and thinking about it and what these forays into the history made clear to me was that the Electoral College had been not only unpopular but denounced in many ways in the form in which it currently exists, and we'll get to that. Uh, for 200 years or more, this was the dissatisfactions with it began about 20 minutes after it was created. So there was a long history of dissent. There was a long history, and has been, and it continues, of efforts to change it. And then uh, add to that in the modern era, ever since we've had reliable polls, which is the 1940s, um, it's been clear that a majority of the American population would like to get rid of it or change it in some dramatic way. So what we have is this institution. The word in the 19th century that was used most commonly to describe it was cumbersome. So we have this institution that has long had severe critics, where their constitutional amendments have been introduced to change it close to 1,000 times. The American people would like to get rid of it, and yet we still have it. So that's what shaped the question, which shaped the book.
Yeah, it's interesting that we've had an institution that has been pretty unpopular, and most people have argued for its reform or abolition really ever since the founding. Like you said, right after the founding, there were these complaints arising about it. But forgive me, I wanted a brief tangent just because I'm curious. You mentioned some of these other democratic institutions that you were going to research. What are some of those institutions that you would consider undemocratic that we have today?
Well, I'm not sure they're undemocratic, and I think, for example, having single district first past the post elections for Congress, and other offices. Again, that was not necessarily the case in elections for Congress. There were sort of multi-candidate districts in the first 30 or 40 years. Um, and then one of the others was campaign finance, was our system of financing elections. So those were what struck me as the three most glaring institutional features, or three of the most glaring institutional features.
Yeah, that's interesting. I find campaign financing to be a big problem, and it's one that I've talked a little bit about on previous episodes, and I would like to do flesh that out a little deeper one day. But I do think that's a big problem.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very, very serious problem, and and it gets a lot of attention during presidential cycles, but I think it's even, frankly, it's even more pernicious just for members of Congress, and other offices. If you talk to members of Congress, especially those who are from districts that are in any way contested, and I've done this, and they tell me they hate it and that they spend a majority of their working time raising money. Uh, Doesn't seem like a good way to run a railroad.
Yeah, it's more so kissing up to the corporate and the guys with the big checks rather than the voters, huh?
It's less time consuming.
But anyway, so in broad terms, and then we can kind of get more into the nuance of it, what exactly is the Electoral College?
The Electoral College, and by the way, let me start by saying the term Electoral College does not appear in the Constitution. Uh, it's never used in the Constitution. It was not the term that was used by the framers, and it wasn't even used much in the 19th century. Um, in the 19th century, there was a common reference to the electoral colleges, which was the meeting of electors in the capital of each state after an election. The term electoral college as a phrase to describe the whole system really is a 20th century term, or predominantly a 20th century term. So, having cleared up the language right here at the outset, um, what is the Electoral College? It is a complicated system um, for choosing presidents, by states, um, and that tries to reflect the powers of the states, or it tries to. I'm sorry, tries to reflect the assembled influence of the state. That's not well stated. So let me talk about the specific mechanics of how it works. It's a system where each state gets a number of electoral votes based on the number of representatives it has in the House of Representatives, plus two for its senators. So it's basically the number of electoral votes mirrors the representation of a state in Congress. That's sort of the first step. That is obviously the weight that each state gets in the election. Um, in the Constitution, as written, it is left to each state to decide how it will choose its electors. There is no requirement that there be a popular election. There's no requirement in the US Constitution that there be a popular election. And certainly, winner take all, the system that we know today, and that's present in 48 of the 50 states, does not seem to be what most of the framers had in mind. They thought that electors would be chosen by district. At the outset, the first 10, 15 years, actually the first 30 years, but even right at the outset, many states did choose their electors by district. Others did it through winner take all, which was then called the general ticket. And in still other states, the legislatures chose electors by themselves without any popular elections. So you have this constitutional framework of how much influence a state gets. You have latitude left to the states to decide how they're going to choose electors, and then as the system proceeds, the notion is that uh, these electors, and as originally framed, that it was believed that they would deliberate, that these would be the purpose of this was to have people who were wise and experienced and might know national politics. They would meet in each state capital on the same day, doing it on the same day to avoid excessive influence or corruption from one state to another. They would meet on the same day. They would cast their electoral votes. Those electoral votes would be sent to Congress in the process, which we all became vividly familiar with 4 years ago. But there's one other feature which really has to be mentioned here, which is that uh, many of the framers of the Constitution, and this is still in the Constitution, did not think that the electoral college or the electoral votes would, as a rule, be deciding the election. In the minds of the framers, again, there was no party system in their minds. Indeed, they were skeptical, to say the least, of parties. They didn't want parties. There was certainly no two-party system. And the common belief was that there would be three, four, five, six candidates for president. And as a result, it was widely believed that frequently that nobody would get a majority of the electoral votes, because the electoral votes determines the presidency only if one candidate gets a majority. Okay. And then, so they created also what is now referred to as the contingent system, which is if nobody gets a majority, then the election reverts to the House of Representatives, which is the more popular house, um, and more numerous house, but with a strange election rule that every state only gets one vote. So no matter how large, how small, um, each state gets one vote. And that contingent system is also sort of not very democratic as it operates. It was widely denounced, but it was used only twice, in 1800 and 1824.
Yeah, it's interesting, that sort of safety net, because a safety net of Congress choosing the president if one candidate didn't get the electoral votes, because one of the big concerns of the founders was that if Congress chose the president, then the president would be more beholden to the interests of Congress as opposed to the American people.
I don't know. That's exactly right. I mean, in the debates in Philadelphia, writing the Constitution, having Congress choose the president was kind of the default position for a lot of people. And then they would do a straw vote, and most people, more people would favor that than anything else. But then everybody would shake their heads and say just what you iterated, which was that this is not a good idea. Congress would control the president, etc. Um, but that's also why I may also be why they opted for this system, this contingent system, where each state delegation, it wasn't really Congress voting. Um, I mean, in fact, uh, to back up a little bit, if it's okay to say something about the origins of how they came up with this design. Um, that again, this was one of the subjects, this was one of the difficult subjects that they encountered. They could not agree on how to choose a president. They kept going around and around in this in the summer of 1787. And in fact, they got to the end of the summer, uh, and they had resolved many issues, including the two big issues, which would have had to do uh, with whether there would be a bicameral legislature or not, and whether the legislature would be based on population or every state would have equal representation. And then the other big issue was slavery. Um, they got to the end of the summer. They had resolved most of these things, but they still hadn't reached a decision about how to choose the chief executive. So they did what any good group would do at large. They went on vacation, and left behind a quotes committee on unfinished parts, and said, "You guys deal with it. It's Philadelphia. It's late August. Sort of we're tired. It's hot here. So you guys work it out, and we'll come back in a week and tell us what you came up with." And it was this committee on unfinished parts that came up with this. And to say something about the rationale of the design is that part of what it did was to incorporate the compromises that have been made on the two big conflictual issues into the Electoral College design, so that those issues didn't have to be reopened, i.e., that it said, in deciding how many electoral votes each state would get, it basically said, well, it's the equivalent of the number of members of Congress that you have, and we've already hammered that out. It would be one chamber based on population and the other not. And then by doing it that way, they also implicitly sort of transferred the three-fifths clause into presidential elections as well. So in a certain way, the Electoral College is a replica of Congress, although its members cannot be members of Congress, but it's a replica of Congress which avoids the corruption and undue influence issues in the fact that the Electoral College only meets once and then dissolves. There's no fear of ongoing influence.
Yeah, I definitely want to flesh out the Constitutional Convention. I did a podcast episode a little bit ago with David Stewart, who is the author of Summer of 1787, and we talked all about the Constitutional Convention. So if anyone wants to really learn more about all of the debates that were held at the Constitutional Convention, they go check that out. But were there the debate surrounding the Electoral College? Obviously, this committee comes to the decision of the Electoral College, the compromise. What were the other sort of agendas that some of the delegates had surrounding how to choose the chief executive? Was there a push for a popular vote even back then?
There was a push for a popular vote, a small push. There were some people who thought that there should be a popular vote. Benjamin Franklin was one of them. Um, and notably, James Madison came out in favor of a popular vote. Basically, Madison's logic. I mean, he's so you follow this through. He's so rigorous in his logic, um, and but he basically says, he seems to be thinking on his feet as these debate because this isn't right at the beginning of the convention, but he's saying, well, look, uh, president has to be chosen either by some group of selected people or by the people themselves. And any group of selected people, has problems. There were ideas, for example, that the governor should choose the president. Uh, and then obviously the idea of Congress choosing the president. And he went through and said, any of these other intermediate groups are problematic. So let's have the people themselves choose the president. And he acknowledges at the time, he's explicit because he's a smart guy and he's looking around, and he says, I know that that will disadvantage my region, meaning the South, because if there is a popular vote, then the South will get no influence based on slaves. Um, and but he said, but in the long run, this is what's best. So he favored that, but most of his fellow Southerners did not agree with him. Not surprising, and a lot of people worried that uh, that the country was still, was too dispersed, that the population was too dispersed, that people would not have personal acquaintance with the candidates, and thus that it would be better to have intermediaries of one sort or another. But again, there were a lot of ideas. There were ideas of having various people serve as electors that floated around, and then ideas. There was. I think somebody even proposed doing it randomly among members of Congress. Just about every idea you could imagine came up.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people criticize the Constitutional Convention, the Electoral College, the Three-Fifths Clause for its appeasement to slavery and their inability to deal with that issue. But it's very nuanced to talk about this because the slave states were repeatedly threatening to walk away. If we wanted a constitution, if we wanted any sort of cohesive government, there had to be a compromise on slavery.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the slave states would have walked if something had been done. And the Three-Fifths Compromise, which seems so awkward and ugly to our eyes, it was a compromise.
Yeah, I really don't. I mean, I'm not exactly a political expert or was there, but I really don't see another way sort of around that. I feel like they had to come to that compromise, and by now a lot of those compromises are definitely outdated. We had to deal with an entire civil war around the issue of slavery because those ideas and compromises were outdated. But something that I like to talk about that I find interesting when it comes to democracy and elections is public education and a knowledgeable citizenry. Now, at that time, America was very rural. People were very dispersed on farms. They weren't exactly involved in national politics. There wasn't good media. There wasn't social media to spread news around at a rapid rate, nationwide. So, how does the issue of that play into the Electoral College? Because an issue that the delegates and the founders were dealing with was that they didn't want to necessarily give all this power, this voting power, to people who had really no idea what was going on in national politics.
Well, and I think that was the idea of letting them choose electors, um, and that these electors would be people who were more knowledgeable, more respected in the community, um, and might take their jobs seriously, and also, I mean, in the original design, that they would come together in their state capitals and they'd have discussions about the candidates. So I think that was that was really the way they tried to deal with that. We also have to keep in mind that even those who spoke in favor of a national popular vote um, were not necessarily in favor of an extremely broad franchise. Uh, one of the oddities of our Constitution is that there is really no franchise requirement. There is no voting requirement. There is no right to vote in the Constitution. Um, more generally, and different states had different requirements, which were usually uh, basically financial, well, also gender, and age. So it wasn't a view of what we would in a modern era call mass voting.
Yeah, generally, I feel like when the founders were talking about a national vote, they really just meant white landowners.
Yeah, like landowners or taxpayers, or that's what most of them. Again, it varied by state. Um, the different states took different positions on this.
Yeah. So coming out of the Constitutional Convention, if people today were to go back and look at how the Electoral College operated right out of the Constitutional Convention in the late 1780s, early 1790s, how different would that look than today's Electoral College?
I don't think it would have looked too different, except in one key respect, which was, again, there were not parties, there were not tickets, and the design of the original Electoral College was that the person who won the most votes, if a majority, became president, and the person who won the second most votes became vice president. Um, and that's how we ended up with Adams as president and Jefferson as his vice president, even though the two at the time were somewhat bitter rivals who years later became good friends. Um, so that was really a very different design, but then at the same time, I mean, it's this very uh, it's a little bit if you build one, they will come. You create a competitive political system, and then parties emerge. Um, and parties are emerging in the 1790s, even though they're not calling themselves that. But you know, the 1800 election precipitates a kind of crisis about the lack of designation between the presidential and vice presidential candidates, because Jefferson and Aaron Burr get the same number of electoral votes. Um, so then the one constitutional modification that has occurred in the presidential election system since the founding was the passage of the 12th Amendment, which basically provided for designation and party tickets.
Yeah, that's really interesting and foreign if you think about today. I mean, can you imagine Trump being Kamala Harris's VP or vice versa? Wouldn't that be funny?
Yes, it would be. Um, and we can think of, so many historical examples. I mean, it just would have been, an entire, just an, it was an entirely different system and an entirely different conception of what these elections would look like. And yet, what seems to have happened is that it was outmoded very, very quickly. And to save themselves from another crisis such as occurred in 1800, they modified the Constitution. I should add here, as my own particular, uh, or a finding that I made, and that I find interesting, is that uh, as the 12th, as energy rose to do the 12th Amendment, it was originally conceived to have two parts or to be accompanied by another amendment, which was to have a constitutional requirement that electors be chosen by district and not by winner take all. This was precipitated by the fact that many people did not like winner take all, and then specifically precipitated by the fact that in 1800 Virginia changed its method of choosing elector from district to winner take all in order to prevent John Adams from getting a couple of electoral votes, uh, and thus possibly becoming president. Because, in fact, that was a couple of votes from Virginia had helped Adams become president in 1796. So there was this partisan, opportunistic switch in the method of choosing electors in 1800. And then it was followed, Massachusetts then retaliated and did the same thing, and everybody's acting for partisan reasons. Um, and so there was a lot of energy at that time, a lot of support, and this would continue for 35 years. Um, but a lot of support for a constitutional amendment to require districts. But it got removed from the effort for the 12th Amendment, um, in part because Jefferson's own party was in power. They had taken advantage of that, and even though in the 1790s they had been firm opponents of winner take all, um, by 1802, 1803, it was, we can live with this all right.
Yeah, changing tides change their sentiment. So there actually was, um, before winner take all, it actually was the delegates were and the votes were by district.
In some states, Um, it varied from one. It was a mess. It varied from one state to another. In my books, that I have a chart. Oh, this. But not only did it vary from one state to another, um, but states changed their method of election from one election to the next.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Um,
That's
and
crazy.
and it was producing a kind of instability and chaos that persisted into the 1820s.
For sure. How are you going to build a society or a stable election process on something that's changing every election as opposed to a strong institution? But I want to flesh a little bit more about the role of race in all of this and the three-fifths compromise and sort of the balance between the southern slave states and the northern states and who held more power coming out of the Constitutional Convention in elections. So how is, one of your arguments is that the Electoral College, its legacy is rooted in slavery. So can you explain that a little bit?
I mean, I think that the roots in slavery obviously are it's grounded in what we discussed before, which was the this in deciding to import the three-fifths clause, or by basically having electoral college votes equal number of congressional representatives. It is giving white Southerners power and influence, um, in proportion not only to their white populations, but to their very substantial black populations, which consisted of people who were enslaved and couldn't vote. So that's, I mean, uh, that is the link uh, to slavery. Although I think I disagree with some of the scholars who see the Electoral College as having been deliberately grounded, in an attempt to preserve slavery, because I think that really the key decisions and compromises there were made around Congress, and they were imported into the presidential election process. But there's another way of looking at this, which then becomes very consequential later on, which is that in adopting the what we call the Electoral College system, um, the Constitution gives states power and influence in presidential elections in proportion to their populations rather than the number of voters. Um, so that Virginia will get X number of electoral votes uh, in a presidential election, no matter how many people turn up. Um, and this becomes, I may be getting ahead of the story as you want to narrate it, but this becomes extremely important after the Civil War, after slavery is abolished, and the Three-Fifths Clause uh, is abolished. And what happens, after the Civil War, there are a couple of decades when many African Americans are voting and are participating in politics, and then they are driven out again by various state laws. And they're disenfranchised, and at the point at which they are disenfranchised, which is the late 19th century, at that point, white southern states and white Southerners are benefiting from what one might call the Five-Fifths Clause rather than the Three-Fifths Clause, because in fact African Americans are counting 100%, not two, not three-fifths. They're counting 100% towards representation in Congress and thus towards electoral votes, um, but they are still not voting. So in fact, the racial disparity is even greater in 1900 than it was in 1800.
No, that's a fantastic point. You're almost reading my mind. That's exactly where I wanted to go to next was how, once slavery was abolished and the Three-Fifths Clause was discarded, how that impacted the electoral landscape because it gave them a lot more power in terms of representation in Congress because now they were counted as five-fifths, as you would say, as opposed to three-fifths. But how did that impact the electoral landscape when it came to the presidential elections with the Electoral College? Because these African Americans are now voting, and obviously they're going to have different interests than their Southern slaveholders. So, how did that impact when it comes to the presidential elections? Did that impact the electoral landscape at all?
Well, it may have impacted the electoral landscape in 1876. Um, I think less so in 1872, but 1876, 1880, because there were, especially in state elections, there were not only African American candidates and African Americans, elected to office, but there were coalitions of Republicans and Unionists from the Civil War with African Americans. Um, there was a lot of politics going on. I mean, as the historian and my friend Steve Hahn has written about very eloquently. There's a lot of black politics going on and black political influence, but uh, in terms of the electoral college and presidential elections, it's hard to see it as really being decisive. Although, again, there's the celebratedly controversial 1876 election in which Hayes is made president by an electoral commission, even though it seems to be the case that Tilden won more popular votes, um, but in fact Tilden won a greater popular vote in part because of voter suppression of black Republicans in the South.
Exactly. Exactly. That's another aspect to this conversation is, now African Americans they have the right to vote, but that gave rise to a whole, new movement of violence and suppression against them with the poll taxes and the literacy test to kind of suppress their vote. So, I really don't know how the African Americans being enfranchised to vote can impact the elections if now they're just being suppressed with, things like the poll tax and the literacy test?
Well, the poll tax literacy test and more draconian methods than that. I mean, we now, I mean, in the last 20 years, have the story of what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, when they're, in the 1890s, when, in effect, elections are overturned and there's something like a full-scale war going on against African Americans who are politically active. So, there's an embattled period uh, from the mid to late, from the late 1870s into 1900 in some states. In some states, it's over before that. But the upshot of it leading into the 20th century is a system in which the vast majority of African Americans in the South are not permitted to vote, but yet they count towards congressional representation of southern states, and they count towards their electoral votes. I mean, um, and I somewhere in the book, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but I compared the number of, I think it was in 1910, the number of vote, or 1910 there was not a presidential election. 1908, 1912, um, I compared the number of votes cast in the South compared to the number of electoral votes, and it was something like there were 6 or 7 sort of uh, southern states where the popular vote, all total, was about the same as Ohio's popular vote. But if you added those 6 or 7 states together, they had vastly more electoral votes. So that you're creating a system where to state it somewhat differently, it's the population that's really determining the influence of the state, and there is no sanction for disenfranchisement. In fact, you're rewarding the minority. You're giving them more power, uh, and that's the way it worked until the late 1960s.
Yeah, I think there's a clear case to be made that the abolition of slavery actually helped the Southerners in terms of their representation and voting power.
Oh, I think there's no doubt about it. And then within Congress, of course, you see this from the late 19th century, but going into the 20th century with the seniority system within Congress in terms of who would chair congressional committees. Um, you're basically creating a one-party region without competition, and you have Southern chairs of all of the major committees, including those committees that that would have jurisdiction over any legislation or constitutional amendments that could reform the system.
Well, that's interesting. While we're on this topic, how did female suffrage impact the electoral landscape? Because there's this whole new demographic of voters that are now have the ability to vote. Did they really just end up voting kind of the same as their husbands or their families, or did female suffrage have a noticeable impact?
I think the conventional wisdom is that after women are enfranchised in 1920, um, that they voted pretty much the way men voted, except that they were tended to be more sympathetic to candidates um, who favored certain kinds of social welfare provisions. Um, and but that basically they voted pretty much the same way men did and at lower rates for the first decades of their enfranchisement. But then later on, and I don't know where the turning point is. Obviously, you start seeing a gender gap in relatively recent years in terms of how they vote. I just happened to see on television last night that a very significant gender gap in the polling for the 2024 election. But I don't know when that emerged.
Yeah, that would be interesting to look at when exactly that emerged. Because definitely now today, women tend to vote more Democratic, more liberal, and men tend to vote more Republican and conservative. But you've made the claim that the Electoral College isn't a standalone institution and that it's inextricably tied to federalism. So How is that so? And do you think the abolition of the Electoral College and maybe a popular vote would lead to a more unitary government as opposed to a federalistic government?
Well, I think that if we abolished the Electoral College and replaced it with the national popular vote, I think that that would lead to a more, uh, it would lead to a kind of more unitary government. It would lead to, um, it would lead to a certainly a greater uniformity of rules and practices. I mean, one of the oddities of the election system as it exists, even today, I mean, even after uh, all of the voting rights actions of the 1960s and 1970s and the court decisions, et cetera, which ended many forms of discrimination. But it is still the case that people have the right to vote for president in one state might not have that right to vote for president if they lived in another state. Uh, so that there's a way in which it is still not quite a national election. It is a federal election. And part of the part of the problem with or part of the legacy of the design, and it's part, it's built in. I mean, this country was launched as a collection of states coming together. It's we're called the United States of America. We're not just called America or a single name. It's the United States of America. But part of the problem, one of the issues, is that in that basic structure, any efforts to standardize in the name of social justice or in the name of even efficiency, but any or in the name of national values, say the national value of democracy, um, any attempt to standardize can be perceived as a transfer of power to the federal government from the states and can be resisted on those grounds. And that resistance, to say, well, you're taking power away from the states, and we don't want to do that. And that resistance sometimes can be sincere, but it can also be a cover uh, for other motives and other interests. I mean, states' rights, which was the cry of the conservative white South in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, it was about the state's right to discriminate against black people, and not a broader conception of states' rights.
Hmm. Is that sort of the people who make the case? I'd like you to play devil's advocate for a minute. The people who make the case that the Electoral College is a good institution and should be upholded, is it on that basis that they want to sort of protect the power of the states and avoid a unitary government?
On which basis? On that basis, when you say on that basis.
That taking power away from the states and sort of their states' rights. I know, a lot of it was states' rights to discriminate, but it would take their sort of voting power away.
Well, I think that look, my own view, and I don't want to be too argumentative about this, but I'm happy to be somewhat argumentative.
Oh, please do. I love it.
Um, is that I think that the people who defend the Electoral College on federalism grounds, and and sort of protecting the states, I think that it's really often a cover for other interests that they have. It's not. It's really not clear that states benefit from the existence of the Electoral College. I mean, yes, it's the case that if you're a swing state in a modern presidential election, you'll have a lot of money pouring in television advertising and campaign expenses, and your hotels will be full periodically. Um, and then even more than that, if you're a swing state, and it looks like you're going to be a swing state next time, federal monies go in disproportionate amounts. I mean, through legislation, et cetera, or through executive action. Federal monies go to swing states more readily than to other states. Um, and So but beyond those factors, which are not really what's advertised as the advantages to the states of a federal system, I don't really see it. Um, you know, there's a relatively little that one can spot as an interest of a state per se as a state. I mean, we do have different interests in this country, um, and you know, agriculture is one interest, right? Agricultural and farming. But I think the largest farming state in the United States is California, uh, which also has San Francisco and Los Angeles and a number of other cities. So it's very hard to identify interests of states that need to be protected by a federal structure for presidential elections.
Hmm, that's interesting. Okay. We talked a little bit about it earlier, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about it, and that's how delegates are chosen. So these aren't elected officials, and you mentioned that some of them Congress appoints the delegates, which goes back to that issue that the founders were dealing with, and that you know indirectly the president could be beholden to Congress if the delegates are just appointed by Congress. So the way states appoint these electors vary state from state. So how are they chosen, and why is it a problem that it's so varied?
Well, it's not so varied anymore, but it was a problem uh, as they were trying to get the system going. Um, that I mean, you know, well, let me backstep. You have this original conception that uh, people are going to vote for in one fashion or another, or even the legislature is going to choose these electors who will be experienced and wise and have good judgment, and they will come together in the state capitol and talk about who the best candidates are. Um, that model is gone within really less than a decade of the writing of the Constitution. I mean, there's a famous sort of quote from one person who said about an elector. Um, I don't vote for this elector. I didn't vote for him to think. I voted for him to vote a certain way. And so basically, essentially by 1800, the electors are just messengers, and they're not playing any deliberative role. They're not interjecting their own opinions, or their own wisdom or their own knowledge. They have become partisan messengers. Um, and that so and they can't be, the electors cannot be members of Congress. They cannot hold any other office under the United States. Um, but so they are chosen, and still by 1800, 1810. Some states are choosing them without elections. The legislatures are choosing them. Others are using districts. Others are having elections, but winner take all. And they're changing things around every 4 years, depending on the interest of the state and the maneuvering that's going on. I mean, this extends into the 1820s when Martin Van Buren, the creator of modern parties, is involved in remarkable number of manipulations in order to try to make sure that his candidate, will have the advantage. So it's chaotic, and during that period, I mean, it's something which, it's ancient history. There's no reason, or it's not ancient, but it's for Americans, it's ancient. You know, it's not well known, but um, the Senate passed constitutional amendments 4 or 5 times between 1813 and 1826 to require states to use districts, to abolish uh, winner take all. I mean, it passed in the sense of it had a two-thirds vote, or more than a two-thirds vote. And one of those years, I think it was 1821, the House came very close to a two-thirds vote uh, as well. So that there might have been a constitutional amendment passed in the early 1820s that would have prohibited winner take all. Um, but it was blocked is really blocked uh, by by a certain number of large states who did not want to do that. And then a kind of equilibrium was reached in practice, which was that all states would have popular elections to choose the electors, except South Carolina, which held out until 1858. Um, but all states would have popular elections, and that they would all use winner take all, um, because if many states were using winner take all, or some states were using winner take all, other states didn't want to give up the partisan advantage by not using, by just having district elections. And that's, that, to get way ahead of the story, is also why subsequent efforts to switch away from winner take all and towards districts on a state by state basis, which is constitutionally possible, have not had so much success.
So that has been a recurring theme throughout American history that there have been many efforts to reform or even abolish the Electoral College in favor of a popular vote. Why? I mean, a lot of these you mentioned they're passed in the House, passed in the Senate. Why have a lot of these have been successful? Why have they all ultimately failed?
Well, it's been different for different measures, but in terms of the efforts to replace the Electoral College with a national popular vote, the failure really has to do with the opposition of the white South. Um, in 1969, a constitutional amendment that would have abolished the Electoral College and replaced it with a national popular vote was passed by, I think it was an 82% vote by the House of Representatives. I mean, that seems so strange to us now, where the current House couldn't get an 82% vote about what day it is. Uh, but they, by an 82% vote, they voted in 1969 to abolish the Electoral College. It then went to the Senate, where it was held up for a while by the chair of the Judiciary Committee, named Allen Eastland, who's a Mississippi planter. This is goes back to my references to committee chairs and their Southern committee chairs and their power. Um, but the foremost advocate of this amendment, Senator Birch Bayh from Indiana, figured out a maneuver around Eastland and eventually got it to the Senate floor, where in the summer and fall of 1970, and it was filibustered. It was filibustered by a group of Southern senators with one Midwestern Republican colleague, Roman Hruska from Nebraska. But it was basically filibustered by Strom Thurmond and Sam Ervin and several other Southern senators. So that, and the reason was, I mean, when you probe into it, the reason was, even though there was a lot going on and had been going on with voting rights and African American voting rights, was that they still, particularly people of that generation, the older generation, perceived the Electoral College to be a real bulwark for defending the rights of the South, because um, it had given Southern states disproportionate power in national politics. Um, so that maintaining racial hierarchies had a great deal to do with these defeats, and that was the story through the 1970s.
Hmm. So what about today? How do we get people to? Because people, it seems that they don't really care. I mean, every time the election comes around, especially in 2016, after Trump lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College, a lot of people, you know, complained about it. But then it just fades away back into irrelevance. How do we get over this issue? What do you propose that no one really cares, no one has a compelling reason to change it? What do you think will get us over that hump?
Um, if I knew Jake, I'd bottle it and sell it. It's you know um, I think that, well, let me say a couple of things. It's a, there's a kind of, since the, after that failure in 1970, there was another effort in the 1970s, which had a lot of support, but didn't come close to clearing the Senate again. And since that time, the Republican Party, or most Republicans, but I think even the party itself, has concluded that the Electoral College benefits Republicans, that they have what was called, quotes, a lock on the Electoral College. There have now been two elections in which they won the presidency but lost the popular vote. Uh, um, and they seem adamant about sticking with the with the electoral college. Um, Although from time to time, many Republicans, even in the last 15 years, have questioned that. I mean, or questioned the virtues of winner take all. This is a long prelude to answering your question about how we get from here to there. I think that, in a certain way, in terms of nitty gritty congressional, I think that there has to be a popular movement, and I've been working with some people to try to see what we can do uh, to build one, and to build one also that will go beyond each election cycle. Every 4 years around this time, we're having a lot of talks about the Electoral College, and that will continue into December, maybe into January, depending on what happens, and then it will fade from people's minds. So it's and this rhythm about the appearance of energy for Electoral College reform and then it receding. This is commented about in the late 19th century as well. So there's one comment that that's saying, something like people are only concerned about the roofs leaking when it's raining, and then the sun comes out and they don't pay any attention. So I think that it will take a movement. It will take some leadership, such as provided some person or persons in Congress who really want to make this their cause and will stick with it. For a while. I mean, I've interviewed members of Congress, and they all seem to think that that's the case. And I think that one other source of possible hope for change is that the fate of the Republican Party is, I think, unclear at this point, in the sense that the Republican Party has become something now quite different than it was uh, 10, 15, 20 years ago. A lot of those Republicans are now publicly voting for Kamala Harris. And I don't know whether it will lead to a fracturing of the Republican Party, to the appearance of another sort of center-right party that looks like what the Republican Party used to look like. We don't know that. I certainly don't know that. But what I do know is that the times that we have come closest to Electoral College reform have been times when the party system was in flux. That was the case in the 18 teens and the 1820s, when basically the original two-party system had disappeared, the Federalists had disappeared, and everything was sort of within a large amorphous Democratic Republican party until the 1830s, when things began to reshape. And I think that one could argue, and I have argued, that in the late 1960s, in the second half of the 1960s, and even the early 1970s, that there really was no longer a two-party system in the United States, that there were three or four parties. I mean, I think that the split between the northern liberal wings of the Democratic Party and the southern conservative wing of the Democratic Party were so severe by 1968 that to think of them as one party was wrong. And there were somewhat analogous splits between what one could call the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party and the Rockefeller wing, for lack of better terms. And I think that when you have uh, shape shifting in the party system and maybe in the structure of the party system, then it becomes sort of much less possible for people to base their position on electoral college reform on a clear cut and predictable partisan calculation. So I think it's possible that we will get into another period like that sometime fairly soon. And that might create more of an opening with the other factors that I mentioned for successful electoral college reform.
That's interesting. So you think there's actually a possibility that in the near future we actually could move away from the two-party system?
Well, or the or the two party system will get reconfigured in some way. I mean, we have. I mean, the United States is somewhat unusual in having a very durable two parties. I mean, but that's not an accident. It's not because these are such great parties. It's partly because we have laws that are largely unseen that make it difficult for third or fourth parties, and a lot of people are actually working now to try to make it easier for third or fourth parties. But I think that I I mean the question that I ask, and I don't claim any great expertise in this. The Trump wing right now there only is a Trump wing of the Republican Party. Um, if they win in November and win a lot of things in November, well, they're going to remain dominant, and then it's just a question of where those other Republicans are going to go. But if they lose, um, and um, then there might be an effort to reclaim the party by some of those old Republicans, or there. I think we might see um, a political configuration um, that would be in flux, where there would be a MAGA party, a center right Republican Party, and a Democratic Party. Although then probably the Democratic Party might itself show some divisions between uh, its left wing and its centrist wing. So again, um, historians are not particularly better at predicting the future than anyone else is, but um, I think that it is quite possible that we're going to see a period of instability in our party structure, and that might facilitate electoral college reform, uh, and the adoption of a system that is more justifiable and comprehensible.
Hmm. th- That's a very interesting point. So you would say that there's a lot riding on this current 2024 election. There's a lot at stake here.
Yeah, I think yes. I mean, um, uh, yes. I mean, things even more urgent and pressing than electoral college reform. However close that's dear to my heart. But I do think that there's a great deal at stake, and that I think that claims that democracy itself, or American democracy itself, is somewhat at stake in this election are not overstated. I think that um, we either have, if democracy means that the people participate and decide, uh, who runs the government, and the people have the right, and what that also means is um, that the people have the right to peacefully throw a previous government out. I mean, that's that's really that's essential. And if the processes that yield that are not fair and are not open and are not transparent, and then if they also include intimidation and possibly violence. So I think that that is a significant deterioration of democracy, and I think that we could face that in various places.
So, do you think Donald Trump is a threat to democracy?
I do. I do.
Looking to the future, if it doesn't happen this election, a lot of people are saying that this will be the last election. I don't buy into that, but do you think that it will happen in the future possibly? Do you think it's inevitable?
What is the it?
The threat to democracy, the end of American democracy.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't buy into the notion that this will be the last election. I think that there's an awful lot of people out there who would be really enraged. I mean, um, I think that the political rights would be weakened not through some not by a declaration that there will be no more elections, but a gazillion different measures that will, that will make it more and more difficult for people to vote, or more and more people or parties to get on the ballot. I mean, there's a lot of small corrosive steps that will take place. As to whether the demise of American democracy is inevitable, I guess I have a two-part ambivalent answer to that, which comes in part out of I teach a course about the rise and fall of democracies globally.
Oh, wow. Oh, so you have a very firsthand insight to this sort of issue, huh?
Well, I'm not sure how insightful it is, but I have opinions.
Well, feel free to share them.
Well, I mean, I guess I would say two things. One is that um, I don't think there is anything, and I think that this has been a real change in thinking in the U.S. I don't think there's anything inevitable about the preservation of American democracy or democracy in any other particular country. Um, I don't think it's guaranteed to endure. I don't think democracies are guaranteed to endure any place. Okay, and I think that we could encounter various crises, domestic and international, that could turn the United States into a quite profoundly undemocratic country for a while. Um, the flip side to that is that when I look at the long history of democracies and political institutions, um, is that any government to remain in power for any long period of time, um, has to eventually get the consent of the people in one form or another, or the consent of a large proportion of the people. I mean, you can repress, you can scare the daylights, intimidate, and repress uh, people for a while. And the while can be, could be a person's lifetime. I mean, it can be 50, 60 years, or more likely 20 or 30 years. But when you look at the history of other regimes, other countries, there's a burbling up of a desire for democracy. I mean, in fact, there was, at least at some point, there was some polling that was suggesting that people who lived in undemocratic regimes were much more pro-democracy than people who actually lived in democracies. Uh, so there's a yearning for participation and for the freedoms that might accompany it. So I think that if American democracy falters, it won't be forever. And I don't know what that will look like, and I don't know what the resuscitation will look like. Um, that's my long answer to your question.
I think I agree with that sentiment. I mean, I don't think anything can last forever. I truly believe America's the greatest country in the world. I believe in America's greatness, but America, the way it is today, at least, it's impossible that that will last forever. Obviously, and to your point, I would agree with that. When I look back at history, it seems that even though democracy is not perfect, democracy seems to be the best form of government that human beings have been able to come up with. I as sort of a intellectually curious answer. I'm very intellectually curious with anarchism. What would you say about anarchism and their belief sort of in like no government as opposed to democracy? Do you think anarchism could ever work?
I mean, I had a period in my life when I was younger when I felt a certain allure to anarchism and anarchism, and syndicalism. I mean, I was a great fan of the Wobblies, um, but no, I don't think it can work. And I think that part of the problem that we had, and maybe it may have looked this way at the end of the 19th century too, in the early 20th century, but um, I think that we have technologies, a technological basis to so much of our society that reinforces hierarchy. I think that our technologies reinforce hierarchy and concentrations of power in ways that would really make it very difficult to sustain a no government anarchist uh, system or world. I mean, I understand the lure and the attraction, but I don't think it's really feasible.
Yeah, it's a fun political ideology to think about just because it's so extreme. You know, if you've ever seen The Dark Knight, there's a line. My favorite line of the movie is the Joker. He says, "Some men just want to watch the world burn," and I think that's definitely anarchist. Have you ever heard of Michael Malice?
No.
Oh, he's kind of a political commentator. He's an anarchist. He goes on my favorite podcast, aside from my podcast, is the Lex Friedman podcast, and he goes on there a lot, and they kind of talk about all sorts of crazy things. But he's a funny, interesting fellow.
Well, then we return to the second part of what you said. I mean, I also think that that it's the iteration of the a reiteration of the famous Churchill line, but that I think that democracy you know has many flaws, but it's the best form of government. I mean, in the end, I mean, part of where I come out on this is that um, the people have to have a right to change the government, and they have to have a system for doing so. And if you don't have a system for doing so by peaceable electoral means, then what you're left with is violence. And that's all that you're left with as a way of changing governments. And that doesn't seem like a great way to live.
Yeah, some people would argue that is the way to approach it. I 100% fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think that is the answer. Violence has been the answer in the past to certain evils, for example, Hitler, but I don't think the that violence is the answer to to change our American democracy. I truly believe in democracy. To leave off on a quote from one of possibly the best presidential speeches of all time, JFK was speaking about the Berlin Wall, and he said, "Democracy isn't perfect, but we've never had to build a wall to keep our people in." I think that's a fitting place to leave off on. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it. Thank you for helping me and hopefully the audience better understand the Electoral College, why we have it, and the American democracy.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, and best of luck.